The top of Hacker News, week of August 31st through September 6th, 2025. Introduction. Welcome to the top of Hacker News, where we bring you the most engaging, controversial, and thought-provoking stories from a week's worth of tech discourse. This week, we reviewed over 200 stories and handpicked the 10 that sparked the most passionate debates, the deepest technical discussions, and, honestly, the most anger in the community. From fundamental questions about who really owns our devices to billion-dollar copyright settlements that could reshape AI development, to developers absolutely losing it over popular frameworks, we've got a packed episode that captures the pulse of what's got the tech world fired up right now. So let's dive in, starting with a philosophical bombshell that had nearly 1,200 people arguing about the very nature of device ownership in 2025. Story. We should have the ability to run any code we want on hardware we own. All right, now we're diving into something that really struck a nerve on Hacker News. We should have the ability to run any code we want on hardware we own. This one pulled in over 2,000 points and nearly 1,200 comments. And honestly, it's touching on something fundamental about our relationship with technology. So here's the thing. The author makes this really interesting argument that completely reframes the whole debate about device freedom. We've all been complaining about App Store restrictions, right? Can't sideload apps on iOS, Google Play's policies, all that stuff. But they're saying we're missing the forest from the trees. The real issue isn't that Apple won't let you install whatever app you want on iOS, it's that you can't rip iOS off entirely and install something else. Think about it. When you buy a laptop, you can wipe Windows and install Linux, or vice versa. Nobody questions that. But try doing that with your iPhone or your Samsung Galaxy, and you're basically looking at an impossible task. Not because the hardware can't handle it, but because there's no documentation, no drivers, no support whatsoever for alternate operating systems. The author makes this distinction that I think is really clever. They're saying Apple and Google aren't actually restricting what you can do with your hardware. They're restricting what you can do with their software. iOS is Apple's creation, Android is Google's, and when they limit what apps can run, they're setting boundaries on their own software, not on the physical device you bought. Now, the Hacker News crowd, they had thoughts, and the discussion went places I didn't expect. One of the most compelling threads wasn't even about the technical aspects. It was about how society has basically made this whole debate moot. Multiple commenters pointed out that even if you could install a completely open-source OS on your phone tomorrow, you'd still be screwed because your bank requires either an iOS or Android app. Your kid's school uses apps that only work on official operating systems. Government services, healthcare portals, even parking meters. They're all built assuming you have either Apple or Google in your pocket. One commenter put it perfectly. We've created a society where participating in basic civic and economic life requires submitting to one of two tech giants. That's kind of terrifying when you think about it. But here's where it gets interesting. Not everyone agrees this is even a problem that needs solving. There's this user, Turi, who makes the argument that, actually, locked-down devices serve a real purpose. They protect people who aren't tech-savvy from malware, from scams, from breaking their devices. Your grandma doesn't want to accidentally install a custom ROM. She just wants FaceTime to work. And you know what? That's a fair point. The technical challenges are real too. Even if Apple was legally required to provide full hardware documentation tomorrow, and the author actually suggests this as a solution, who's going to write the drivers? Who's going to maintain them? Apple's not going to open source their iOS drivers, so any alternative OS would need to recreate years of engineering work from scratch. We're talking about camera systems with multiple lenses and AI processing, secure enclaves for biometric data, neural engines for machine learning. And then there's the business model problem that kept coming up in the comments. Open source projects for mobile operating systems have tried and failed. Remember Firefox OS? Ubuntu Phone. They couldn't compete because there's no sustainable revenue model.
You can't charge for the OS because people expect it free with the hardware. You can't make money from an app store if you're truly open. So who pays the developers? What really resonated with me from this discussion is how it reveals this fundamental tension in tech right now. On one side, you have people saying, I bought this device, I should control it completely. On the other, you have the reality that most users actually prefer the walled garden because it works better for them. And stuck in the middle are those of us who see both sides, but feel increasingly uncomfortable with how much power we've handed to just two companies.
The author's solution, requiring companies to provide complete hardware documentation, it's elegant in its simplicity. It doesn't force Apple to change iOS at all. It just says, hey, if someone else wants to write an OS for this hardware, you need to give them the manual. But even that modest proposal faces huge challenges. The comments pointed out that modern devices have so many proprietary components from different manufacturers, all under various NDAs and patent agreements. The legal complexity alone is staggering. You know what this really reminds me of? The right to repair movement. Same fundamental question, who really owns the things we buy? And just like with right to repair, we're seeing this clash between theoretical ownership rights and practical market realities. The market has spoken, and most people have chosen convenience over control. But that doesn't mean we should stop fighting for the right to choose differently, even if we're a minority. Speaking of control and corporate power, let's shift to a massive legal development that could reshape the entire AI industry. All right, so our next story has the tech world buzzing, and honestly, it's got me pretty concerned. Anthropic has reportedly agreed to pay $1.5 billion to settle a lawsuit with book authors over copyright infringement. Yeah, you heard that right. Billion with a B. Now, when I first saw this headline with 915 points and 700 comments on Hacker News, I thought, okay, here we go again with the AI training data debate. But folks, this is way more nuanced than I initially expected. See, what's fascinating here is that, according to the discussion, this settlement isn't actually about whether AI companies can train on copyrighted material. It's specifically about how Anthropic allegedly obtained that material in the first place. The commenters are pointing out something really important. Apparently, Anthropic used datasets from LibGen and what they're calling plimi, which are basically pirated book repositories. So we're not talking about the philosophical question of, is training AI on books fair use? We're talking about, did you literally download pirated copies to do your training? And that's a completely different legal beast. What's got everyone really fired up, though, is what this means for the future of AI development. Think about it. If it costs $1.5 billion just to settle one copyright case, who can afford to build AI models anymore? We're basically saying only the Googles, Microsofts, and OpenAIs of the world get to play in this sandbox. One commenter made a really sharp observation that this could push all the innovation to countries like China that don't have the same copyright restrictions. They're not wrong. If American companies need billions just for legal settlements while their international competitors can train on whatever they want, that's a massive competitive disadvantage. The open source community is particularly upset about this, and I get it. How's some scrappy startup or research lab supposed to compete when the price of admission includes a potential billion-dollar legal bill? It's like we're creating this artificial moat around AI development that has nothing to do with technical capability and everything to do with who has the deepest pockets. But here's where it gets really interesting. There's this commenter, MHH, who's taking a completely different angle. They're saying, look, maybe this is actually good for humanity in a weird way. Their argument is that AI is making knowledge from books accessible to people who would never have read them otherwise. It's ugly, it's messy, but maybe the ends justify the means. I don't know if I buy that entirely, but it's an interesting perspective. And then you've got MaxXCZ coming in with the cynical take that honestly kind of hits home. They're basically saying this proves that in America, it's totally fine to steal as long as you steal enough money to pay the fine and still come out ahead. Anthropic's valued at what, $18 billion now? So a $1.5 billion settlement is just the cost of doing business. What really strikes me about this whole situation is that we're trying to apply 20th century copyright law to 21st century technology, and it's not working.
Several commenters are suggesting we need something like a government-provided training library or international copyright exceptions for AI training. And honestly, that might not be a terrible idea. Because right now, we're in this weird place where the technology is racing ahead, but the legal framework is dragging behind. And these billion-dollar settlements are the result of that friction.
The thing is, this settlement could set a really dangerous precedent. If every AI company that trained on books has to pay out billions, we're essentially saying that only the already wealthy can participate in AI development. That's not just bad for competition, it's bad for innovation, it's bad for open source, and ultimately, it's bad for all of us who benefit from diverse AI development. While Anthropic's dealing with billion-dollar settlements, another tech giant just got what amounts to a slap on the wrist for monopolistic practices. Google can keep its Chrome browser, but will be barred from exclusive contracts. All right, now let's dive into what might be the biggest anticlimax in tech antitrust history. Google can keep its Chrome browser, but will be barred from exclusive contracts. This ruling just dropped from Judge Amit Mehta, and honestly, the market's reaction tells you everything you need to know about who won here. So remember last year when Google was found guilty of maintaining an illegal monopoly in search? Well, the Department of Justice came out swinging with some pretty hardcore remedies. They wanted Google to sell off Chrome, maybe even divest Android. These were nuclear options, right? The kind of stuff that would fundamentally restructure one of the world's most powerful tech companies. But what we got instead was, well, Google stock jumped 8% in after-hours trading. That's a $200 billion increase in market cap. When you're found guilty of monopolistic practices and your stock goes up that much, you know you basically got away with it. Here's what actually happened. Judge Mehta said no to forcing Google to sell off Chrome or Android. Instead, Google just can't make exclusive deals anymore. And even that comes with an asterisk. They can still pay to be the default search engine. They just can't demand exclusivity. So those billions they pay Apple every year to be the default on iPhone, that gravy train might actually keep rolling, just with slightly different terms. The Hacker News crowd is having a field day with this, and the discussion is fascinating. One commenter put it perfectly. This is like tying two fingers of a 500-pound gorilla. I mean, think about it. Chrome has something like 65% market share globally. Android powers the vast majority of smartphones worldwide. And the remedy is, please don't make exclusive deals. It's almost comical. But here's where it gets interesting. There's actually a decent argument that this might be the right call. One user, Hansen Q, made a compelling point that Chrome didn't win through anti-competitive practices. It won because it was genuinely better than Internet Explorer and Firefox at the time. Forcing Google to sell it would be, in their words, eminent domain by the government. And you know what? There's something to that argument. Chrome succeeded on merit initially, even if Google later leveraged it for search dominance. The confusion around what this ruling actually means is pretty telling too. Different news outlets are reporting conflicting things about whether Google can still pay for default placement versus exclusive contracts. The distinction matters enormously here. If Google can still write those massive checks to Apple, we're talking billions annually, just without the exclusivity clause, then what really changes? Apple's not going to suddenly make Bing the default if Google's still willing to pay top dollar. Speaking of Apple, their stock jumped 4% after hours too. There was real concern they might lose that Google money entirely, which would have been a significant hit to their services revenue. But now it looks like the cash might keep flowing, just with some modified terms that probably won't matter much in practice. What's really wild is the judge's reasoning seems partly focused on not hampering competition in AI. Several commenters pointed out the irony here. The judge is essentially saying we need to preserve Google's strength so they can compete in AI markets. But isn't that fundamentally anti-competitive thinking? You're protecting a monopolist because you're worried about future competition in a different market. And then there's the elephant in the room that nobody's really addressing in the ruling.
ChatGPT and AI search might make all of this moot within 5 years anyway. Multiple commenters are pointing out that Google's search monopoly is already starting to crack. Younger users are increasingly turning to ChatGPT for queries they would have Googled before. The whole search paradigm might be shifting underneath us while we're still fighting yesterday's antitrust battles. The community reaction really captures the absurdity of it all. One commenter joked that Google executives were weeping into their Hermes handkerchiefs over this ruling. Another pointed out that the $200 billion stock increase is literally more than the entire market cap of most Fortune 500 companies. This isn't a penalty, it's barely even a slap on the wrist.
You've got to wonder what message this sends about antitrust enforcement in tech. If you can be found guilty of maintaining an illegal monopoly and the market celebrates your punishment, are we even pretending to regulate these companies anymore? The DOJ spent years building this case, won on the merits, and then watched the defendant's stock price soar when the remedies were announced. That's not how deterrence is supposed to work. The technical folks on Hacker News are also raising some really good points about implementation. How do you even enforce no exclusive contracts in practice? Google's relationships with device manufacturers and browsers are incredibly complex. There are so many ways to structure deals that achieve the same effect without technically being exclusive. And who's going to monitor all of this? The same regulators who took a decade to bring this case in the first place? At the end of the day, this feels like a victory lap for Google disguised as a regulatory action. They keep their crown jewels, maintain most of their business model, and just have to be slightly less aggressive about locking down exclusive deals. Meanwhile, their stock price suggests investors think this is actually good for business long-term, maybe because it removes the uncertainty of potentially harsher remedies down the road. Now let's shift from corporate titans getting away with monopolies to something that's making developers absolutely lose their minds. As our voice shifts to an energetic podcast host. Next.js is infuriating. All right, shifting gears here, let's dive into something that's got the development community absolutely fired up. Our next story is Next.js is infuriating. And wow, with over 1,000 points and nearly 500 comments on Hacker News, this one clearly struck a nerve. You know, it's fascinating when a framework that's supposed to make our lives easier becomes the source of so much frustration. And that's exactly what's happening with Next.js right now. The discussion thread is it's brutal, honestly. Developers are coming out of the woodwork to share their pain points, and the consensus is pretty damning. So here's what's really grinding people's gears. The middleware situation in Next.js is apparently a complete mess. Get this. You can only have one middleware file. One! If you're coming from Express or literally any other modern framework where middleware chaining is just how things work, this is mind-boggling. Imagine having to cram all your authentication logic, rate limiting, logging, and whatever else into a single file. People are calling it a fundamental misunderstanding of what middleware even means in web development.
But that's just the tip of the iceberg. The real nightmare seems to be this whole confusion about where your code actually runs. You've got edge runtime, server runtime, client runtime, and apparently it's anyone's guess which context you're in at any given moment. One developer described it as constantly playing a guessing game about whether their code is running on the server or the client. And I mean, that's not a game you want to be playing when you're trying to ship production code. What's really interesting, though, is how this ties into Vercel's business model. There's this underlying current in the discussion about how Next.js feels increasingly designed to push you toward Vercel's hosting platform. The framework's complexity almost seems intentional, like they're creating problems that, conveniently, their paid platform solves. Now, I'm not saying that's definitely what's happening, but when multiple developers independently come to that conclusion, it makes you think. The CEO of Vercel actually jumped into the thread, which you've got to give him credit for that. He acknowledged some of the issues, but the community response was basically too little too late. People are already jumping ship to alternatives like Remix, SvelteKit, or just going back to good old Express with some templating. Now, to be fair, there were a couple of defenders in the thread. One person argued that the middleware limitations are actually by design, that what Next.js calls middleware is specifically meant to be lightweight edge functions, not the traditional middleware we're used to. They're saying critics are conflating different concepts. But even if that's true, when this many developers are confused, maybe the framework's mental model is the problem, not the developers. Here's what really gets me, though. One commenter nailed it when they said, Next.js adds layers of abstraction that, and I quote, 99.99999% of projects don't need. We're talking about a framework that's supposedly making React easier to use, but instead, it's adding its own Byzantine complexity on top. Simple tasks that should take 5 minutes are turning into hour-long debugging sessions, trying to figure out which runtime you're in or why your middleware isn't working the way you expect. The granular control over server versus client execution, sure, in theory, that's powerful, but in practice, it's creating this massive cognitive overhead where developers spend more time thinking about the framework than actually building features. And isn't that exactly the opposite of what a framework should do?
What's wild is seeing how passionate people are about this. This isn't just mild annoyance. Developers are genuinely angry. They feel like they've been sold a bill of goods, invested time learning this framework, built projects on it, and now they're stuck maintaining code bases that are way more complex than they need to be. The phrase over-engineered came up, maybe 24 times in the thread. You can really feel the frustration when people talk about trying to do simple things, adding basic middleware, understanding where their code runs, or just trying to debug issues and hitting these walls of unnecessary complexity. It's like, remember when React itself was criticized for being too complex? Next.js was supposed to be the solution to that, and instead it's become its own special kind of problem. Speaking of developers dealing with tool frustration, let's look at another contentious switch in the containerization world. All right, now let's dive into something that's stirring up quite the debate in the containerization world. Our next story is I ditched Docker for Podman. And wow, with over 1,000 points and more than 600 comments on Hacker News, this one really struck a nerve in the community. So here's the deal. This author basically looked at their Docker setup one day and said, you know what, I'm done with this security nightmare. And honestly, when you dig into their reasoning, it's pretty compelling. They're calling out something that a lot of us have just accepted as normal. Docker's daemon runs with root privileges. Always has. And that daemon, it's this persistent process that's basically got the keys to the kingdom on your system. The author brings up some pretty scary CVEs to make their point. There's CVE 1957-36, which was this run-C container escape vulnerability, and then CVE 2022-087. They call it dirty pipe, which, these aren't theoretical problems. These are real vulnerabilities that let containers break out of their sandbox. And when your container runtime has root access, a container escape basically means game over for system security. Enter Podman. What makes Podman different is that it's daemonless and rootless by design. There's no persistent daemon sitting there with elevated privileges waiting to become an attack vector. Each container runs in its own process, and you can run the whole thing without root. It's like, imagine if instead of having one security guard with the master key to every room in your building, each room just had its own lock that only opened when needed. Much smaller attack surface.
Now, here's where it gets interesting, and this is what I love about the Hacker News discussion. The community is totally split on this. You've got people who made the switch and are loving it, saying things like, I migrated 6 months ago and never looked back. But then, oh boy, then you've got the horror stories. One user, Michael, makes this really pragmatic point that kind of deflates the whole security argument. They're saying, look, most developers are using Docker Desktop locally anyway, which runs in a VM, and in production, everyone's using Kubernetes with Containerd, not the Docker daemon. So who exactly is running Docker daemon with root in production? It's a fair question. The compatibility issues people are reporting are honestly pretty rough. Docker Compose support in Podman is apparently a mess. Multiple users are saying they tried to switch, spent days fighting with it, and just gave up to Docker. There's this whole thing about the Docker Socket API, tons of tools expected to be there, and Podman's compatibility layer is, let's say, inconsistent, is being generous. Platform support is another whole can of worms. If you're on a Red Hat-based system, apparently you're golden. Podman works great. Ubuntu? Good luck getting a recent version without adding third-party repos. macOS? The comments suggest it's basically unusable for serious work. One person said they literally couldn't get a simple Node.js dev container working on their Mac with Podman. But here's what really caught my attention. There's this deeper philosophical debate happening in the comments. User 1A5277D drops this bomb. They're questioning whether we should be using containers at all for local development. They're saying we've added all these layers of abstraction, containers, orchestration, service meshes, and maybe we should be removing complexity instead of just switching to a different container runtime. The rootless thing, which is Podman's big selling point, turns out it's not all sunshine and rainbows. You've got UID mapping issues that make file permissions a nightmare. Network performance apparently takes a hit unless you use this thing called PAST, which is another layer of complexity. And if you want to integrate with systemd for service management, well, let's just say the comments section has some colorful language about that experience.
What strikes me about this whole discussion is how it reflects where we are in the containerization journey. We've gone from Docker is amazing, containerize everything, to wait, what have we actually signed up for here? The author mentions this evolution in thinking, that initial excitement about Docker, that just Dockerize it mentality has matured into questioning whether we've been trading security for convenience without really thinking about it. And you know what? Both sides have valid points. Yes, Docker's architecture has some fundamental security concerns, but also, yes, Docker's ecosystem is mature, battle-tested, and it just works for most people. Podman might be architecturally superior, but if you can't get your development environment running, that's a non-starter. The fact that this generated 628 comments tells you everything about how divided the community is. This isn't just a technical debate. It's about development philosophy, security priorities, and honestly, how much pain you're willing to endure for a potentially more secure setup. Some people in the comments are basically saying, I'll take my chances with Docker's security model if it means I can actually ship code without fighting my tools all day. It's fascinating to see how a simple, I switched from X to Y post can reveal such deep fractures in how we think about modern development infrastructure. Now, speaking of companies trying to reinvent infrastructure, let's look at Stripe's bold move into blockchain territory. All right, our next story is absolutely fascinating. Stripe just announced they're launching their own blockchain called Tempo. And before you roll your eyes and think, oh great, another blockchain, this one's actually pretty different from what we've seen before, and the Hacker News crowd had some very strong opinions about it. So here's what's happening. Stripe, the payments giant that basically powers half the internet's transactions, has partnered with crypto investment firm Paradigm to build a completely new Layer 1 blockchain. But here's the kicker. They're not trying to be the next Ethereum or World Computer. Nope. Tempo is laser-focused on one thing: payments. Just payments. And they're claiming some pretty wild performance numbers, over 100,000 transactions per second with near zero fees and sub-second finality. To put that in perspective, Ethereum handles about 15 transactions per second. Even Solana, which everyone talks about as the speed demon of blockchains, theoretically maxes out around 65,000. So Stripe is basically saying, hold my beer, to the entire blockchain world.
What's really interesting, though, is who's involved. They've got this absolutely bonkers list of design partners: Deutsche Bank, Visa, Shopify, DoorDash. But then you also see OpenAI and Anthropic on that list. Yeah, the AI companies. Which immediately makes you wonder, what exactly are they planning here? Are we talking about AI agents making autonomous payments? Micropayments for every chat GPT query? The possibilities are kind of mind-blowing, actually. But here's where it gets spicy. The Hacker News discussion, with over 1,000 comments, by the way, is basically split into two camps, and they're going at each other pretty hard. On one side, you've got the skeptics, and honestly, they make some solid points. Their main argument is essentially, why do you need a blockchain for this? If Stripe controls the whole thing anyway, couldn't they just use a database? Like a really fast PostgreSQL cluster would probably do the same thing without all the blockchain complexity. One commenter put it perfectly. They said this feels like regulatory arbitrage dressed up as innovation. And you know what? They might be onto something with that regulatory angle. See, traditional payment processors like Stripe have to deal with tons of banking regulations. But if you're dealing with stablecoins on a blockchain, suddenly you're in this gray area where the rules are different, maybe looser. And here's the really clever bit. If Stripe can get even 3% of their transaction volume converted to stablecoins sitting on their platform, at current interest rates of around 4%, they could be looking at $1 billion in annual revenue just from the float. That's real money. Patrick Collison, the Stripe co-founder, actually jumped into the discussion himself, which doesn't happen often. He basically argued that all the crypto skeptics are missing the forest for the trees. He pointed out that companies like SpaceX and Dollar App are already using stablecoins for actual, practical financial operations. Not speculation, not NFT nonsense, but real business needs. Moving money across borders, dealing with banking infrastructure gaps in emerging markets, that sort of thing. But even with his defense, the technical necessity question keeps coming up. Like, if you're Stripe and you control all the validators, and you're the one deciding who can use the network, at what point does calling it a blockchain become more about marketing than actual decentralization? It's like calling your diary a distributed ledger because you keep copies in different rooms.
There's another angle here that I find fascinating, though. This could actually be Stripe's play to challenge the Visa and MasterCard duopoly. Think about it. Those two companies have had a stranglehold on payment processing for decades, taking their cut of basically every transaction. If Stripe can create their own payment rails with near zero fees, that's a game changer for merchants. Suddenly, that 2 to 3% transaction fee could drop to almost nothing. The timing is interesting, too. We're seeing this convergence of AI and crypto that nobody really saw coming a year ago. The fact that OpenAI and Anthropic are design partners suggests they're thinking about payment infrastructure for an AI-powered future. Maybe it's about AI agents that need to transact autonomously, or perhaps micropayments for API calls that would be too expensive with traditional payment processing. Look, whether this succeeds or fails, you've got to admire the audacity. Stripe's basically saying, we've processed trillions of dollars in payments, we know what doesn't work with current systems, and we're going to build something better from scratch. Will it actually be better or just different? Time will tell. The community reaction really captures the broader tension in tech right now. Are we solving real problems or just creating complex solutions in search of problems? With 791 points and over 1,000 comments, clearly this struck a nerve. And honestly, I'm not sure either side is completely wrong here. Maybe Stripe doesn't need a blockchain for this, but maybe, just maybe, they're seeing something the rest of us aren't yet. Shifting from cutting-edge tech to something more human, let's look at a fascinating experiment in connection during isolation. All right, so our next story really caught my eye. It's called 30 Minutes with a Stranger, and it's fascinating on multiple levels. This is about the Candor Corpus project, where researchers collected nearly 1,700 conversations between complete strangers over video calls, and they've created this really interesting interactive visualization showing one of these conversations in real time. So here's the setup. They got about 1,500 people to hop on video calls with total strangers for 30 minutes, completely unstructured, just talk. No agenda, no topics provided, just two people who've never met having a conversation. And Kate and Dawn, the two people featured in this visualization, they're just regular volunteers who signed up for this during the pandemic.
You can actually watch their conversation unfold minute by minute through this timeline interface on the website.
Now, what's really interesting here is the timing of all this. These conversations were collected during COVID, when everyone was starved for human connection, right? And the Hacker News community had a field day with this. Some folks are pointing out that there's probably massive selection bias here. Like, if you're the kind of person who signs up to chat with strangers for research, you're probably already pretty agreeable and open to begin with. The curmudgeons and introverts aren't exactly lining up for this kind of thing. But here's where it gets deeper. A lot of commenters are using this as a jumping-off point to talk about how different face-to-face conversations are from online interactions. One person made this great point about how when you're actually looking at someone, even through video, you rarely get the kind of petty nastiness that's so common in comment sections and social media. There's something about that human presence that just changes the dynamic completely. And then there's this whole thread about social isolation being this massive underlying problem in modern society. People are connecting it to extremism, to mental health issues, to radicalization. There's actually solid research showing that loneliness and isolation are major factors in people going down these dark paths online. It's like we've built all these systems for connection, social media, messaging apps, all of it, but somehow ended up more isolated than ever. Now, the website itself became this whole controversial thing. They've got this innovative scrolling timeline where you can see the conversation progress, and people are completely divided on it. Half the commenters are like, this is brilliant design, so innovative, and the other half are literally getting headaches trying to use it. Someone called it inaccessible, and there's this whole debate about whether innovative design should come at the cost of usability. But let's talk about what this data is actually for. This candor corpus, it's meant to help researchers understand natural conversation patterns. And yeah, you can see where this is going. Training AI, making chatbots more natural, improving human-computer interaction. We're essentially creating this massive data set of how humans actually talk to each other when there's no script, no agenda. The privacy implications here are, well, they're using pseudonyms and got consent, but still, we're talking about 1,700 recorded conversations that researchers can analyze down to the smallest detail. Every pause, every and every topic change. It's all data now. And while it's for research, you have to wonder about the ethics of turning human connection into training data. One commenter brought up this hilarious counterpoint, though. They said they specifically choose Waymo over Uber because they don't want to talk to the driver. Like, here's this whole study about how great it is to talk to strangers, and meanwhile, half of us are paying extra for self-driving cars just to avoid small talk. The thing is, and this is what I find most compelling about this whole discussion, there seems to be this disconnect between what we think we want and what actually makes us feel good. People go into these conversations dreading them, thinking it'll be awkward or boring, but then they come out feeling energized and connected. It's like we've trained ourselves to avoid the very interactions that might actually help with all this isolation we're experiencing. What really strikes me about this project is that it's capturing something we're losing, the art of unstructured conversation. No agenda, no trying to network or sell something, just talking. When's the last time any of us did that with a stranger? Or even with friends, honestly, without phones buzzing and notifications pulling our attention away. The researchers are essentially creating a time capsule of human conversation from this specific moment in history, pandemic era, video call mediated, between strangers who volunteered for science. And in 10 or 20 years, this dataset might be incredibly valuable for understanding not just how we talked, but how we connected during one of the most isolating periods in modern history. Now, let's explore something completely different, a technical challenge that had developers geeking out over geometry. All right, so here's something that really caught my eye on Hacker News today, making Minecraft spherical. Now, I know what you're thinking, Minecraft on a sphere, the whole point of Minecraft is that everything's made of cubes, right? Well, that's exactly what makes this so fascinating.
A developer just built this tech demo called Blocky Planet, and they've somehow managed to map Minecraft's entire cubic voxel system onto a spherical planet. And get this, they did it in just over a month while working a full-time job, putting in about 15 hours a week. That's pretty impressive dedication right there. So the technical challenge here is absolutely wild when you think about it. You're taking a game that's fundamentally built on the idea that everything is a perfect cube, everything aligns to a grid, and you're wrapping that around a sphere where, well, nothing wants to be a perfect cube anymore. The developer used Unity 6 with C#, and they're leveraging Unity's job system and burst compiler for optimization, though interestingly, they didn't go with dots.
What really gets me about this project is how it surfaces all these design problems you'd never think about. Like, in regular Minecraft, you dig straight down and eventually you hit bedrock. But on a sphere, if you keep digging, you're heading toward the core of the planet. What happens when you get there? Do you pop out the other side? Does gravity flip? The community discussion around this has been incredible. People are suggesting everything from limiting dig depth to using toroidal geometry where you'd somehow loop back around. The Hacker News discussion is actually super engaged on this one. 123 comments and counting, with lots of developers sharing their own war stories about spherical voxel systems. Turns out this is like a white whale for a certain type of game developer. People are bringing up space engineers, eco-global survival, even this game called Love that apparently tackled similar problems. One commenter pointed out that Eco actually uses what they call a more elegant solution. They keep the voxel grid completely flat and undistorted, but then render it as a sphere. So you don't get any of the distortion problems, but the trade-off is that travel times aren't accurate to what you'd expect on a real sphere. It's clever, but it's also kind of cheating the fundamental problem, you know? And then there's this whole mathematical rabbit hole about cube-sphere mapping and geodesic spheres. The key insight that kept coming up is that you need to use spherical linear interpolation, SLURP, not LERP for the math nerds out there. Otherwise, your blocks start looking wonky as you move away from the equator. Someone even suggested the developer should have started with a tetrahedra instead of a cube for automatic level of detail benefits, which, honestly, that's the kind of suggestion that sounds brilliant until you actually try to implement it. But here's my favorite part of the whole story. The developer spent over a month building this technically impressive demo, solving all these complex mathematical problems, optimizing the performance, and then spent over 2 months just writing and illustrating the blog post about it. There's something beautifully human about that. Like, the coding was the easy part, but explaining what you did, that's where the real work is. And I really respect their stance on not turning this into a full game. They straight up said the amount of work to go from tech demo to finished product can be monumental. That's refreshingly honest in a world where every tech demo wants to become the next big indie sensation. Sometimes it's okay to just build something cool, share it with the world, and move on to the next interesting problem. The whole project really showcases what I love about the indie dev community. Someone had this weird idea, what if Minecraft but sphere, and instead of dismissing it as impossible or pointless, they just built it. And now we all get to learn from their experiment. The fact that it got nearly 900 points on Hacker News shows that people really appreciate this kind of pure technical exploration. Let's now look at a different kind of challenge, one that sits at the intersection of work culture and human limits. All right, so our next story really struck a nerve in the tech community. We're talking about 996 work culture, and wow, did this one explode on Hacker News with over 900 points and nearly 400 comments. You know, there's this fascinating disconnect happening right now in Silicon Valley. On one hand, we've got all this talk about innovation, productivity hacks, working smarter, not harder. And then on the other hand, we've got startup founders literally advocating for people to work from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. 6 days a week. That's 72 hours a week, folks. And get this, Some are even pushing for what they call 007, midnight to midnight, 7 days a week. I mean, that's not a work schedule, that's just living at the office. So Armin Ronacher wrote this really thoughtful piece pushing back against this whole movement, and he makes some killer points. He's not some slacker either. The guy openly admits he loves intense work. But here's where it gets interesting. He's calling out this fundamental dishonesty in how founders are framing this whole thing. These founders, they've got equity, they've got the upside if the company succeeds. Your average engineer, they're getting a salary and maybe some options that'll probably never be worth anything. Yet somehow they're supposed to match the founder's intensity? Come on. The community response was, well, let me put it this way. I haven't seen this much agreement on Hacker News in a while. Person after person sharing stories about how working these insane hours didn't just burn them out, it actually made their work worse. One commenter nailed it when they said 996 is basically performative theater. It's not about getting more done, it's about looking committed for investors and management. And this is where it gets really depressing. Multiple people pointed out that when you're forced to be in the office for 12 hours, you're not actually working for 12 hours. You're browsing Reddit, you're taking longer lunch breaks, you're having pointless meetings just to fill time. It's this bizarre cargo cult mentality where we're confusing presence with productivity. There was this one comment that really stuck with me. Someone said that in their experience, the code written during those overtime hours, it's usually garbage. It's the stuff that creates bugs, technical debt, the problems that take weeks to fix later. So you're not just burning people out, you're actively making your product worse. Now, to be fair, there were a couple contrarian voices. One person talked about loving their crazy PhD hours and how it launched their career, but even they admitted the personal cost was huge. And another commenter suggested that maybe for business owners and top executives, given their risk-reward situation, these hours might make sense. But that's exactly Ronacher's point. Don't impose your calculus on people who don't have your leverage. What really gets me about this whole thing is we're supposedly the innovation industry, right? We're the people building AI and revolutionizing how the world works, and our solution to building better products is just work more hours? That's it? That's the big innovation? We're literally importing China's most controversial work practice, which, by the way, even China is starting to question, and acting like it's some brilliant startup hack. The truth is, and the discussion made this crystal clear, sustainable success isn't built on 72-hour weeks. It's built on focused, quality work from people who aren't constantly on the edge of burnout. One commenter mentioned they do their best work in maybe 4 to 6 hours of deep focus a day. And trying to stretch that to 12 hours just means 6 to 8 hours of mediocre output that someone will have to fix later. And here's the kicker. The founders pushing this stuff, they're not dumb. They know this. But when you've got venture capital breathing down your neck and you need to show commitment and hustle culture, suddenly making everyone work weekends starts to look like leadership. It's not. It's just bad management dressed up as dedication. Finally, let's close with a fascinating piece of history that shows how some security challenges never really change. Story. This telegram must be closely paraphrased before being communicated to anyone. All right, now we're diving into something that really caught fire on Hacker News, a story about a cryptic World War II telegram instruction that's been puzzling historians and cryptography nerds alike. This telegram must be closely paraphrased before being communicated to anyone. That's the exact phrase that appeared on diplomatic cables during the war, and it sparked this fascinating 770-point discussion about early cryptographic security. So here's what's wild about this. Someone on Stack Exchange started digging into these old diplomatic telegrams from the 1940s, messages between U.S. embassies in London and Moscow and officials back in Washington. And they kept finding this seemingly contradictory instruction stamped on them. Think about it. Closely paraphrase.
It's almost an oxymoron, right? If you want accuracy, you'd say, quote exactly. If you want it changed, you'd say summarize or paraphrase freely. But closely paraphrase, that's oddly specific. The community absolutely went to town on this one. And the leading theory that emerged is just brilliant. This wasn't bureaucratic nonsense. It was actually a sophisticated security measure. See, during World War II, if you had the original plain text of an encrypted message, you could potentially use that to crack the cipher. It's what cryptographers call a known plain text attack. So by forcing everyone to paraphrase these messages, but closely so the meaning stays intact, they were essentially destroying the original plain text while preserving the intelligence. One commenter shared this incredible detail about how the Allies actually broke the German Lorenz cipher. They intercepted two messages that started with nearly identical text, something like, "Nothing to report," sent at similar times. That repetition, that was enough to start unraveling the entire encryption system. The Germans had gotten lazy, reused similar phrases, and boom, vulnerability exposed. And here's where it gets really interesting from a modern perspective. This same principle, this same vulnerability, it's everywhere in today's encryption. People in the thread were drawing parallels to AES GCM nonce reuse, to Bitcoin wallet security issues. One person pointed out how, even now, if you reuse a nonce in certain encryption schemes, you're basically handing attackers the keys to the kingdom. It's the exact same problem, just 70 years later with fancier math. There's this great irony that someone brought up too, by putting "this telegram must be closely paraphrased" at the beginning of every telegram. Weren't they creating their own known plaintext vulnerability? Like, every single encrypted message starts with the same phrase that everyone knows. It's the kind of thing that makes you wonder if maybe they encrypted that instruction separately or added it after decryption.
What really struck me about this discussion is how it shows the timelessness of certain security problems. We like to think we're so advanced now, but those WW2 cryptographers were dealing with the same fundamental challenge we face today. How do you share sensitive information securely when your encryption might be compromised? Their solution was essentially human-powered output randomization. Instead of algorithmic obfuscation, they just said, "Hey, rewrite this in your own words, but keep it close to the original meaning." One commenter, Big Jono, actually pushed back on the conventional wisdom here. They argued that if you really wanted to avoid pattern detection, you'd want to expand the text, not compress it through paraphrasing. More words means more variation possibilities, right? But others pointed out that the goal wasn't maximum randomization, it was destroying the exact plaintext while maintaining operational utility. You still needed diplomats to understand what was being communicated. The thread also went deep into historical examples, people sharing stories about how weather reports helped crack Enigma, how stereotyped military phrases became cryptographic weaknesses. There's this whole pattern throughout the war where human habits and bureaucratic consistency became the enemy of cryptographic security. It's fascinating to think about the poor embassy staff who had to implement this. Imagine getting an urgent diplomatic cable, and your first job isn't to act on it, but to sit down and carefully reword it without changing its meaning. The mental gymnastics required, especially under wartime pressure. And all because somewhere some cryptographer realized that verbatim distribution could compromise their entire communication system. This whole story really drives home how security has always been this delicate balance between usability and protection. Too much security and your own people can't function. Too little and, well, your enemies are reading your mail. These WW2 officials found this clever middle ground, human-powered fuzzing, essentially, that preserved functionality while breaking the cryptographic trail. Pretty smart for technology that predates modern computers, don't you think? What strikes me most about these discussions is how they reveal the tensions we're all grappling with. The balance between security and convenience, between innovation and complexity, between corporate power and individual freedom.
Whether it's Google keeping its monopoly with a slap on the wrist, or developers fighting with frameworks that promise simplicity but deliver complexity, or even those WW2 cryptographers trying to balance security with usability, these are timeless challenges that just keep manifesting in new ways. The fact that these 10 stories generated over 5,600 comments combined tells you something about how engaged and passionate this community is. These aren't just technical discussions, they're debates about the future we're building, one line of code, one legal precedent, one startup decision at a time. Thanks for joining us for the top of Hacker News. Keep questioning, keep building, and keep pushing back when technology stops serving humanity. We'll see you next week with another round of the stories that matter most to the people building tomorrow. Until then, this has been your curated journey through the best of Hacker News, where the comments are often better than the articles, and every technical decision is a philosophical debate waiting to happen.